Codependency is to some degree an addictive tendency from one and both parties, right? One party, the strong desire to be able to give and to be seen as someone who's constantly giving, and the other one to be taking all the time. Someone who needs someone to enable them, someone who depends on someone to show up for them perpetually and constantly and like provide for them, etc., and unconsciously uses them. Right. So we could see that it's two people who basically are in an unconscious version of an addiction, right?
Right.
So one of the things around codependency, and what I'd like to describe it as, or a definition of codependency, is it's two people in their own unconscious coping mechanisms, not aware that those two coping mechanisms really just enable each other. And the reason why I say coping mechanisms is because a lot of people beat themselves up about codependency, and they beat themselves up about being in those relationships. Alcoholism in itself, sex addiction, drugs, any of those addictions are just coping mechanisms. They're a method to deal with a wound, because no one has really taught us a healthy, constructive method to be able to work with coping with the wound. Right. So the ego develops like a method of like, you know, trying to chase someone for love, or trying to be seen as someone who's absolutely, you know, providing, someone who never wants to upset someone who always wants to enable, as we just talked about.
Right.
And so what it really is just people's coping mechanisms. And why I think that, you know, I like that definition is because when it creates awareness, and when people can see their coping mechanisms, it doesn't just mean that I'm doomed to have this kind of relationship. It just means that this is me unconsciously getting triggered by my fear of being left alone, my fear of not having love, etc. Would you agree with that?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that the root of codependency on both ends, whether you're the person that's over reliant on the other person to get your needs met, or whether you're the person that's sacrificing your needs and over giving, both of them, it's rooted in that fear of abandonment. You know, like I'm willing to do whatever. I'm willing to sacrifice whatever and give whatever it is I need to give to maintain that love and to maintain that connection with you. And I think that's where it's kind of like this new version of codependency, because kind of like how I just did that split of like, there's that person that can be like the over giver, and then that person of being like the over reliant of like, I'm going to get into this relationship with you and you're going to meet every single last one of my needs, you know, like they're both equally unhealthy. So the root of it, I definitely think, is that fear of abandonment, that fear of rejection. And it really comes from just our conditioning, like you were mentioning before. It comes from our conditioning, and kind of like this mindset of, I'm not good enough unless I'm doing for you. I'm not worth anything unless I'm like performing in this relationship. And a lot of the times we don't even notice that we're doing it because we've had to most likely do it with our parents.
Right. And I think what's really magical about it is that fear of abandonment, right? It's so powerful how, just to tell everybody about this, the first part of your brain, one of the first parts of your brain that develops is the reptilian part of your brain. So the part that has to do with like eating, sleeping, pooping, all of that stuff. But the amygdala, which is part of the reptilian brain, also develops then, which is fear. The amygdala has, you know, is the baseline for your emotions, but also fear. So the first ideas of your development are around very often the fear of not having.
Right.
And what do you really want when you're a child? You want love. I want to ask you, what is one of the strongest ways you've seen codependency show up in your workplace? So you said, we've talked about how it shows up in different ways. What is maybe one strong story that you see with codependency in your work?
Last night, I was actually working with a couple. And she came in and she was saying like, oh, all the things that like my husband used to do, he's not doing for me anymore. And like, in order for this relationship to work, I need for him to show up in this way, or else I don't know like what's going to happen. So we talked a little bit about like, okay, what is happening in the relationship? How are you both showing up and showing love? And like, you know, her husband has gone through like certain things. So like who he used to be when they were dating, like, you know, in their early 20s is not the person that he really is anymore. The love hasn't changed in the relationship. However, just the way that they are able to show up for each other and show that love just looks a little bit different. But she's still expecting him to be the person that he was in his 20s. And that's not who he is anymore. So I think that's
She's
kind of
probably
like an
not the same
example.
either.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. So I think like an example of that, like in that relationship, is kind of just like, I'm expecting you to do X, Y, and Z. Like she literally has a list of like what it is that he needs to do in order for her to feel loved in the relationship, rather than kind of
Right.
getting to this point of like, okay, this is who you're showing me to be. This is the love that you're able to give me at this point. And it kind of, it's like she's not really allowing it to kind of like shift back on her in terms of like, can I handle this or not? Like, is this enough
Mhm.
for me or not? A lot of the times when
Right.
we're codependent, we're so focused on changing the other person, and we're so focused on that they need to be this person for me. And it's so
Right.
unhealthy because you're not really, what you're energetically like showing them is that you're not really loving them from the space that they're in. Yet you're not even really to
Right.
come to this acceptance of it. And you don't even have to. She doesn't have to accept that if she doesn't want to. She has a choice. But it's like just that underlying belief. I think that's kind of what's keeping the relationship in this dynamic. And I told
Right.
both of them, I said, you know, I love that you guys are here in couples therapy, but I think individual therapy could be really helpful too.
Yeah. I actually think, you know, on that topic, for me, the reason why I stray away from working with couples is because I feel like couples were individuals before they were a couple.
Right.
And each individual has had so much of their own childhood conditioning and their trauma that they bring to the table in a relationship, which when you're now trying to work together, your ego is definitely going to be like, listen, my trauma is worse than yours.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be heard more than you. You don't listen to me enough. And so at that point, these are two individuals who have not had or gone through any work before, who are not going to let the collective grow at that particular space unless they both want to individually.
Right.
Because they're unconsciously competing. Their egos at this point are like, you know, this, you're bringing this to the table and you're making me seem this way, or the relationship go this way, etc. Which brings me to a point of where I've seen codependency show up really strongly or in a pattern is two things. One, massive internalization, where one individual will take everything that the other partner is doing to mean something about them.
Right.
And so, as you said very rightly, therefore, only if that other person changes, only if that other partner does things a certain way, or only if that other partner gives them the love in the way they think it has to be given, or in the way only they assume that it has to be given. And a lot of that has to do with like Disney conditioning, has to do with conditioning of like romance, like an idea of romance that we think we have, cultural conditioning, etc. But when that isn't met,
right,
this one individual internalizes so strongly that they start to think that the relationship is defunct. And I think that's what gets them to overperform. That's what gets them to overcompensate. That's what then gets them to step into this place saying, okay, I have to basically do this, this, and this, and this, because otherwise I'm not lovable enough. I'm not valuable enough. You know, my partner is not meeting my needs, which makes me feel like I've got something wrong with me. So I need to overcompensate, I need to make my partner feel X, Y, Z, etc.
right.
But another way, which I think people don't realize shows up as codependency, and this might be really challenging for a lot of folks listening, but I'd love for you to keep your ears slightly tweaked to this. A big way that I've noticed codependency show up is between the narcissist and the victim. And this one is difficult to talk about because of the sensitivities to either narcissism or to victimization or victimhood. But I keep telling people this. A victim cannot exist without a narcissist, and the narcissist cannot exist without a victim.
Right.
Because the narcissist thrives upon the manipulation of people who the individual knows they can like mold to get what they need, which is their own validation, etc. Now, simultaneously, a lot of us who've been in relationships with narcissists, we feel alive when we're around the narcissist because we feel like we're of some use.
Right.
We want to be like completely molded and shaped and like, you know, unconsciously bashed in and out just so we feel relevant enough to the narcissist and we can receive that love. It's only when it gets to a point that the pain is high enough that we're like, oh my God, I can't believe that individual did that to me.
Right.
But unconsciously, we were surrendering to that individual for so long. And that, in its essence, is codependency.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can you guys still hear me good? I just want to make sure before I talk. Perfect. Because I just set the
I can hear you perfect.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I set the iPad on top of something, so I just wanted to make sure. But yeah, so it's like, it's this idea of like having to work for love, like having to work like really, really, really hard for love. And like my sense of self-worth is in how much you choose me. My sense of self-worth is in how much you can show me that I'm of use, literally, like you said. And I think the thing that's like, I know when I was in this relationship dynamic very long time ago, it was that fear of abandonment. Just literally, it was just like running rampant in the relationship. That fear of like not feeling good enough if I wasn't doing, if I wasn't giving, you know, and that's just not a good place to be. It's not a good place to be in, because you're placing so much of like your everything into this relationship. And that's the thing about like the codependent and the narcissist relationship. It's like the narcissist, they're both insecure, like in their attachment styles. They both have experienced some type of attachment trauma. But then the thing is that they're just coping with it in different ways. So one person's like, okay, I'm going to take because it's every man for himself. And the codependent is like, okay, well, I need to give and self-sacrifice to the point where I need this relationship to give me that validation, you know?
Yeah.
And I think that's what happens with, like if you are a person who is codependent, you're internalizing everything that happens in the relationship about you. My partner didn't text me back. That means they're cheating on me. My partner did this means that, you know?
Yeah.
It's that hyper, like, I can almost call it like this hyper attunement, but like a negative attunement to your partner.
Like a vigilance, like a hyper vigilance.
Right.
Always scanning yourself for fear, right? Always scanning your surrounding for when things will go bad. Because that's your unconscious belief, is that you don't deserve them to go well.
Right. Right, exactly. So I think that's what's so painful about the relationship, like with the narcissist. And with all of this, you know, I always, being somebody who has healed from this myself, it's going to take a lot of compassion that you have to give to yourself, because that's really kind of like the basis of what we're starting to bring up in this conversation now, is really kind of like the shadow aspects of like this codependent, you know, like we think we're helping and we think that we know what's best for this person, and we want to give and we want to give and we want to give, but it's unhealthy helping. Like it's not allowing them to be who they need to be.
I love the term that you brought up, unhealthy helping. I've never heard that before, but I really enjoy it. And codependency can also exist, for those of you who are listening, can also exist in relationships with your family, not just with your partner. They can exist in friendships. A lot of the time when we feel like we're only of worth to a friend circle when we're, you know, showing up in a certain way or we're providing certain guidance. And like you said, it is the fear of self-abandonment, a fear of abandonment that actually leads to continuous self-abandonment.
Right.
So we're basically now at this point manifesting our own fear because nothing along the way has changed our belief. And one thing I'd like to bring on is like, statistically, I believe the ratio of, you know, how people show up gender-wise in terms of codependency is, it's a larger portion of women who tend to show up as the codependent in that space where they have been conditioned culturally through generations to say, I must be of service to someone to feel some sense of self-worth.
Right.
So now when you have your parents or family, or like, you know, you have generations telling you that as a woman that you can only be valid if you're doing this to someone, you unconsciously will attract a partner, whether it's a man or someone else, you'll attract someone who will unconsciously use you so that you feel like, okay, I am now serving them. I am living this generational dream, which is unconsciously generational trauma. It's like the collective shadow, as you've talked about, that we're living in.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that's why it's kind of like being able to figure out like who it is that you are outside of giving, who it is that you are outside of just always constantly being like of service to someone, to the point where like you just, you know, it's all about them and it's not about you, you know? And I think it, like, even kind of like how you mentioned, it happens to a lot of us, like on this subconscious level. Subconsciously, we're not even like checking in to see like, okay, like what is my intention behind this sacrificing that I'm doing right now? Like, is this unhealthy helping, or like, is this healthy helping? A lot of us think that we're helping and we're not helping people. A lot of us think that like we're loving from this place of authenticity and we're sacrificing so much, but it's really because of what it means about us in doing it. It doesn't have anything to do with the other person and us being there for them. It has to do with like how it makes us feel, you know? So I think with like the significant part about all of this is like with a codependent, like if you've been the type of person that has maybe taken like one of those archetype tests or something like that, usually codependents will show up as the caretaker, like as the caretaker. because that's how they show up in the relationship, and that's where they get their sense of self-worth. And I think what also ends up happening, and this could even be outside of just, this could be past like romantic relationships, it can happen with family too, is that like codependents usually tend to like take on other people's issues and then blame themselves when it doesn't turn out the way that they wanted it to turn out.
Right.
So it's just like this cycle of you just keep going, keep ruminating it, because it all goes back to that fear of abandonment.
Right. And I think the fear of the abandonment very strongly creates this belief, right? So when we don't have that space of love or someone who's there to validate, take care of us, or nurture us, the child now perceives themselves, especially when they're younger, as not being worthy of that love.
Right.
So therefore, to be worthy of that love, they must perform, they must serve, they must, step into a place where, they find themselves valuable enough to be recognized.
Right.
But what it does is, and I was telling someone today as well, that any actions, behaviors, patterns, everything are all a manifestation of a belief. So, as much as you want to change these actions and, manifestations, you can't change them on a continuous basis unless you actually change the belief.
Right.
So then the biggest question is, what the fuck is the belief that's manifesting it?
Right.
And the biggest belief is simply that I am not worthy enough just as I am. Mm-hmm. I am not lovable enough just as I am. And that comes from the place that if I was, people would have actually fucking showed up for me, but they didn't.
Right.
So who I am just by myself is not worthy or not lovable enough. And I think that's the key aspect, which a lot of people have asked, I know, in the questions like, how do you change it? How do you change it? We'll get to the healing aspect. Yeah. That is something big. That's the biggest aspect that needs to be targeted, is saying, how do I change how I look at myself? Not even what the fuck is my partner doing in this relationship? Your partner is just a reflection of how you show up.
Right.
Your partner is just a reflection of what you've attracted, what you brought into your life, what you think of yourself, and what you find interesting, all of those things. And so the first and the most important thing is, what is the evaluation of myself? Like, where do I come from in this? Like, what am I actually hurting from before I question what is my partner bringing to the table?